Hello, my name is Amelia. Let me talking about a couple of conditions which affect facial recognition, namely prosopagnosia and Capgras delusion, and then also just facial recognition in general and the dual pathways which are involved in that. So firstly, Capgras syndrome or Capgras delusion. So this is a condition in which a person becomes convinced after some sort of brain injury or brain damage that certain people close to them have been replaced by imposters or aren't who they appear to be. So this individual can recognize familiar faces still, but they lack the appropriate emotional arousal that is supposed to be triggered by this recognition. And the way the brain copes with this deficit is it creates this illusion that these people aren't who they appear to be, because if they're not having the correct emotional arousal, they must not be the people they're familiar with. Shifting a bit to prosopagnosia, this is a fairly different disorder recognition, commonly called face blindness. It's a kind of visual agnosia that's very limited. It only affects recognition of faces. So in this condition, people are just completely unable to recognize familiar faces regardless of how often they see the person, how much they care about the person. Just cannot recognize. A few types of this. One that's probably most often referenced as face blindness is going to be developmental or congenital prosopagnosia. This will run in families often. This one can have a bit of a varying degree of severity. More interestingly for this case in this conversation, though, is acquired prosopagnosia. This comes in two main types, apperceptive and associative. Apperceptive, there's going to be a defect in the visual perception, which makes the brain unable not only to recognize faces, but just to kind of make sense of faces in general. So when two photos, for example, of two faces, they're going to have a difficult time discerning if they're the same face or different, and just understanding faces in general is damaged. Associative, that visual perception isn't going to be damaged at all. It's going to be intact, but the learned associations with the faces and the ability to store them in memory is damaged. People won't be able to recognize faces. They can distinguish between them, but even people familiar with them, people they would recognize prior to brain injury, they just are unable to recognize. You can see on the right that there's a bit of a model of the main parts involved in these recognition shortfalls. It's mostly the occipital lobes and temporal lobes, and there's a bit of different associations of parts of the brain for associative and apperceptive prosopagnosia. So there's two pathways mainly involved in this recognition. So it's a bit of a simplified model, but there's at least two distinct pathways that go from the visual to the limbic system that are involved in this process. The first is going to be the ventral system pathway. It recognizes faces based on their attributes, and it mediates learning based on visual stimulus. So this is what allows individuals to look at faces and distinguish between them and understand what they see, and then remember this information and recognize people at a later date. The other pathway is going to be the dorsal visuolimbic system pathway. This one manages attention and emotional arousal, and both those are actually super important in both recognition of faces and just memory in general. So this is where you can attach emotional significance to learned objects, which is very important in faces. So the reason I mentioned these two delusions or these two conditions in particular is that they serve as really interesting mirror images of each other. So in Capgras, you have recognition but no trigger emotional arousal, whereas in prosopagnosia, you have that emotional arousal undamaged, but you don't have the ability to recognize faces. So in Capgras, that implicates a damage to the visuolimbic system, including the amygdala. So that input does not trigger the appropriate emotional response due to that damage. If you're prosopagnosia, you're going to have damage to the ventral system pathway. So the emotional trigger isn't damaged, but the ability to understand based on attributes and then store the information is lost. A really interesting part of this, though, is the fact that recognition is not it's not all or none. There is a covert and an overt level to it. So it's not just if you see someone and don't recognize them, it doesn't mean there's no recognition happening. There's just no overt recognition happening. So in prosopagnosia, it's a complete lack of that overt recognition. There is no ability to render it into judgments based on perception. But there is an interesting covert level, and it seems that there is a ability to have an emotional response to familiar faces, even if overtly they cannot discern who they are. So they've studied this in an interesting way. They used an anatomic response as a measure of this, and they use a skin conductance response to measure this. They did this on both patients with prosopagnosia and Capgras. I'm going to read this quote about the experience of prosopagnosic patients real fast from Ellis et al. 1997. Although overt recognition of even the most familiar faces can be lost, some prosopagnosics have been shown to reveal autonomic activity to faces of known individuals. This happens even though consciously the prosopagnosic patient is unable to identify the person. So like I was saying, they will be as far consciously unable to render any kind of identity judgment about who they're looking at. But on an autonomic level, there is still that emotional arousal trigger. So you'll still have those associated feelings for the person, even if you don't know who the person is, which is super interesting. It's been shown in amnesia too. It's talked about a bit in the Ramachandran book, in the theoretical case of a man with no ability to store new memories, seeing the same person over and over, memories, seeing them any of those times, and after seeing them after enough times, it can still trigger an emotional response based on how that person had made them feel all the previous times. Super interesting considering the lack of conscious recognition. So this is really interesting because it really supports that two pathway theory mentioned before. You can tell that the overt recognition is going to be associated with the ventral system pathway. That's the one that allows you to distinguish between faces and store it, where the covert recognition is associated with the visuolimbic pathway and then amygdala and that emotional arousal. So when they examined people with Capgras syndrome in this same way, they found while there was that overt recognition, there was not the autonomic response, and there was not that level of covert recognition, which is really what's behind that feeling of them being not who they seem to be, because that lack of emotional arousal makes it seem as if they don't recognize this person who they know that they should be able to recognize. So this is really interesting. It tells us not only about these two fascinating conditions, but also just in general how our brains process information, and then just how important both emotional arousal and attribute-based distinguishing of features are in facial recognition. That emotional arousal plays such a key role in both the conscious and unconscious levels of it. And it's just looking at cases like this where there's maladaptive sorts of conditions is so interesting as a case study for how brains usually work. Thank you. Here are the references. And yeah.